Welcome to Bunny Trails, a whimsical adventure of idioms and other turns of phrase. I'm Shauna Harrison.
And I'm Dan Pugh. Each week, we take an idiom or other turn of phrase and try to tell the story from its entry into the English language to how it's used today. Have you ever been in a situation where, after it's done, you look back and think, I wish I would have handled that differently? Even if you don't want to go back in time and change it, you still might want to do it differently when confronted with a similar situation in the future. And if you've ever been in that kind of mess, you might say that hindsight is 20/20. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary online, hindsight is 20/20 means, quote, the full knowledge and complete understanding that one has about an event only after it has happened, end quote. You may also hear the phrase as 20/20 hindsight. So for this phrase, we are going to break down in the two big parts of it. The first, the concept of 20/20, what that means, and second, the word hindsight. Quote, you may not realize it, but if you have ever had an eye exam, you are likely already familiar with the Snellen chart. It is the eye chart used in nearly every doctor's office. Typically, a giant letter E sits proudly on top with a number of rows of letters underneath that become progressively smaller. If you have ever strained to see those tiny letters on the bottom row, then you are among the millions who have had their vision tested using the Snellen eye chart, designed by Dutch ophthalmologist Herman Sneller in 1862. End quote. So that quote is from an article by the Dean McGee Eye Institute talking about the ubiquitous eye chart used around the world. Part of the system was how it would be measured, 6/6 or 20/20, depending on whether you use meters or feet. Let's look at an article from the American Academy of Ophthalmology to learn more about what 20/20 vision means. The article was written by Celia Vimont. Quote, a person with 20/20 vision can see what an average individual can see on an eye chart when they are standing 20 feet away, says Dr. Kevin McKinney. McKinney is an ophthalmologist and glaucoma specialist at Eye Health Northwest, Oregon City, Oregon. An eye chart measures visual acuity, which is the clearness or sharpness of vision. The top number is your distance from the chart. The bottom number is the distance at which a person with normal eyesight can read the same line. For example, if you have 20/30 vision, it means your vision is worse than average, because 20 feet away, you can read letters most people could see from 30 feet. 20/20 vision is not perfect vision. A person can have 20/15 vision, which is sharper than the average. If you have 20/15 vision, you can see a line on the eye chart at 20 feet that the average person could only see when they are at 15 feet. Dr. McKinney says that only about 35% of adults have 20/20 vision without glasses, contact lenses, or eye surgery. With correction, about 75% of adults have 20/20 vision, and in most states, you need 20/40 vision or better for an unrestricted driver's license. People are legally blind if their vision with glasses or contacts is 20/200 or worse, end quote. So there we go. That is the 20/20 in this phrase, talking about 20/20 vision, which is, they say top number, bottom number, so it's written currently today as 20 and then the slash as if it were a fraction 20, even though it's not really a fraction. It's the top number is how far away you are from the chart, which is 20 feet. You're doing it at 20 feet, right? And then the bottom number is the distance at which what they say is a person with normal eyesight can read at that same line, which I have to ask some questions here about this. So Dr. McKinney says that only 35% of adults have 20/20 vision.
Right, I was struggling with
that. And
that
this calls
part.
into question, right? What is the average person can see at 20 feet? What do you mean by average then? Because it sounds like only 35% of people could see that from 20 feet, which means maybe we're doing this wrong, but I
Like,
don't know. I'm not
how
an
do
eye
you,
doctor
how,
expert.
that's what I'm like, there's got to be something else to this, right? Like, how do you know what the eyes are supposed to be able to see? Like, that's where I'm wondering, you know?
I would imagine the measurement had to have come from when Snellen created it and what people could see around there, and it's just stuck. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know how much there's been change in that. If any of our listeners are ophthalmologists and would like to school us on that, I'd love to hear about it. But we are not here currently to debate the measurement system. Rather, we just need to know that this was the system that was used so we can understand the 2020 portion of the phrase. The Snellen chart and the measurement that goes with it was created in 1862, which means our phrase had to come into existence after that, right? And we know the phrase was an invention of the United States' form of English because outside the United States, they use 6'6" as the measurement, meaning 6 meters, which is 20 feet. However, you might be surprised to learn that we have had the Snellen eye chart and the 6'6" or 20/20 measurement for about the same amount of time as we've had the word hindsight. And that to me was kind of shocking.
That's so weird. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we look at the Oxford English Dictionary, the word foresight means, quote, perception gained by looking forward, a sight or view into the future, end quote. And it has been around since the early 1400s. But what we would consider now its opposite, hindsight, meaning, quote, seeing what has happened and what ought to have been done after the event, end quote, has only been around since the mid 1800s. So hindsight did exist as a word before it was used as the opposite of foresight, but it referred originally to the back sights of a gun and then figuratively for a short time as the backside of anything.
Okay.
So you might say that I got him in the hindsights, which was, I got him on the backside, kind of thing. One of the first times I could find the word hindsight being used as the opposite of foresight is in the White Cloud, Kansas Chief out of White Cloud, Kansas, April 15th, 1858. Quote, many a man could get into a good snap if, as the saying is, his foresight were only as good as his hindsight, end quote. This is referencing it as if it were already a phrase. And while this is, less than 10 years after, or less than 10 years before the Snellen eye chart was created, I would say that it sounds as if, at least regionally, this may have been a phrase at some point. It seems pretty simple to have come to for foresight and hindsight. So we just don't know, because this was the earliest I could find, which frankly is a good 60 years earlier than any of the dictionaries had as this. So this is it's clear that what we had in most of our digitized work was a lot newer, because it looked like in the early 1900s or 1910s and such. But the truth is, this has probably been around since before that, and so it may actually predate by a little bit the Snellen eye chart, but we just can't find I just haven't been able to find any evidence before this time frame other than the statement that as the saying is, which does tell me it's probably been around for at least a little bit before that. Still,
Right.
both of them would have come around in the mid 1800s, or hindsight possibly a little earlier than that. Which means both of these concepts, in the 1800s, and it would take some time in a pre-internet world for a phrase like hindsight is 20/20 to make its way into the metaphorical usage. And as best as we can tell, it took almost 100 years to get to our phrase as we use it today.
That is so interesting, because I don't know. I'm just like, wow, this is a fascinating one to me. Just the fact that they by happenstance these two terms came up at the same time frame, separate from one another, and then that they weren't meshed together for another 100 years is very interesting.
Well, here is the first one that I could find, and this is out of the Stockton Evening and Sunday Record, dated December 6th, 1948. It's a simple quote with no explanation given. Quote, most people's hindsight is 20/20. Saturday Evening Post, end quote. So it's attributed to the Saturday Evening Post. And I think it's interesting here that we usually write 2020 as 20 with the little slash and then 20 again. But in this one, and perhaps owing to them not having the slash available, it just said most people's hindsight is 20 space 20. And that is what we see in another newspaper less than a year later. This is, and in fact, this is about 2 months later. This is out of the Van Nuys News, out of Van Nuys, California, February 17th, 1949. So again, just a couple months from December 6th to February 17th. It is also a simple quote with no explanation, but it is attributed to a person rather than a newspaper. Quote, most people's hindsight is 2020. Richard Armour, end quote. Now, I don't know who Richard Armour was, but what I can feel comfortable about is that this is two different quotations saying the exact same phrase in the exact same way within 2 months of each other.
Right.
So it does seem like, regardless of where it started, something popularized the phrase at the end of 1948 and early 1949. And I will again note that the Internet Archive, which is actually one of the best resources for finding things in this time frame and being able to see a variety of different media sources that would have existed in this time frame, is still down at the time of this research due to a cyber attack on it. So, and then a follow-up cyber attack shortly thereafter. So they are still in the process of getting things back up and moving. So it is possible that in the future I might be able to find more about what happened in 1948 and early 1949 that would have brought this into the consciousness. Was it somebody telling a joke on the radio, or was it because it was being printed in the newspapers, or what happened here that several newspapers started running this? And it's not just being quoted from different places, unless Richard Armour wrote it in the Saturday Evening Post, which I suppose is possible as well. But anyway, that's a really interesting thing. So best I can tell, it took 100 years or so, 80-ish, to get from the Snellen chart and getting to hindsight being 2020.
Wild.
Yeah. All right, the Lowell Sun, June 7th, 1951. This is an article regarding concessions made at Yalta during World War II, which the Republicans at the time felt had contributed to the rise of communism in China. Senator Brian McMahon, Democrat of Connecticut, read into the record a speech given by Senator Alexander Wiley, Republican of Wisconsin, who was the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee at the time of the Yalta concessions, to give better context into the investigations about those actions. Quote, at that time, Riley urged that Russia enter the Far Eastern fighting to force a quick surrender of Japan and save Allied lives. McMahon explained that he was reading Wiley's speech to put the Yalta concessions in the context of their time. He said that is better than viewing them with 2020 hindsight, end quote. I think that is an interesting piece, because he's saying we have to understand where this was in the context of the time itself, rather than in with our perfect knowledge of the past, which is a misnomer. Just because we're past it and we can look back at it doesn't mean we can still understand it more perfectly. But we do have a better hindsight on that still, or better viewpoint on that. So I do appreciate the recognition that it is better sometimes to put history in the context of time as the judge, rather than judging by what we know now.
Yeah.
And that was Senator McMahon's point. The concessions were made at Malta because we could not have known the Japanese would surrender at Yalta. Let's move to 1962, and this next one comes from a news conference with astronaut John Glenn after he returned from the Friendship 7 Mercury spaceflight. It was published in the Evening Star out of Washington, D.C., February 24th, 1962. On the flight, there was an issue with a yaw attitude control jet that had apparently clogged at the end of the first of 3 orbits around the Earth, which resulted in Colonel Glenn taking manual control of the spacecraft. Of course, the cause was not determined for some time, but we know now what it was. I just mentioned it. But a reporter asked him about it, and his answer was mostly that they don't know yet, but they think there were a combination of things that contributed to it. And he finishes his answer with, quote, "It's easy, though, to hindsight this 2020 after you're on the ground, but we're still looking into those things," end quote. So he takes a slightly different stand on this one. It's easy, though, to hindsight this 2020. So it's easy to look back at this with
and see it
with
2020.
average vision and see it, with 2020 after you're on the ground. So and I think that's very interesting. Also, the newspaper at this point had 20-20, the shorter of the dashes. I will say this led me down probably a 2-hour detour as I read about the Friendship 7 Mercury mission. And we're going to look more at it and John Glenn in our behind the scenes video, which is available every Friday on our Patreon, patreon.com/bunnytrailspod. And before we head into the break, there is one other similar phrase that I want to mention, and that is the figurative usage of 2020 vision. And this is similar to what John Glenn had mentioned, where he said hindsight this 2020 after you're on the ground. But this is using a slightly different definition. So this was used to mean that you can see something as it truly is or see it without pretense. And this doesn't use the word hindsight. So it's referring to being able to see it truly in the moment. And this seems to come from the mistaken belief that 2020 vision was perfect vision, something that had numerous claims in the newspapers of the early 1900s, where all of the ads were like, maintain perfect vision with, they were using perfect vision as a idea of what 2020 is. I can read the bottom line, even still today. I can make out the bottom line on the Snellen eye chart, although it has gotten blurry in the last couple of years, but which would put me at 2010 vision. And I would absolutely not claim I have perfect vision. I can see sharply and from a distance of 10 feet that most people could see sharply at 20 feet. But that does not mean that I have perfect vision, because you put something nearby me and I will struggle, and now my arm is getting too short because I feel like I have to get things further away from me to maintain that crispness. So it's a good thing they're not measuring what I could see at 5 feet, because that is where my eyes are slowly going.
Yeah.
So again, the 2020 vision, that's a misnomer, but it was believed to be perfect vision in the early 1900s, and I think that's where this kind of idea comes from. This is one example of 2020 vision being used figuratively, and it comes to us from the New York Tribune, November 17th, 1920. Quote, "And both beholders, life being what you chuck into it and not what you exhume from it, see it truly, with what we in the Army used to call a 2020 vision," end quote. So I mentioned this particular phrase because we saw this before we saw hindsight is 2020. And it seems that this may have been a precursor to the phrase where there was a conversation about being able to see things truly in the moment was 2020 vision. And I don't know if this is related or if they are just cognate, but they obviously they're touching on the same thing, only the recognition that when hindsight is 2020 vision, you can see it more clearly after it's happened. But 2020 vision actually, as far as we can tell, was a phrase being used figuratively first, and as this article put, in what we used to call in the Army 2020 vision, and that was 1920. So and it was the end of the 1940s before we saw hindsight as 2020 being used. So I wanted to mention it because it is similar, and I think it may have been a step along the way, a step in that process of bringing the concept of hindsight as 2020 to a broader audience. Well, we've got more to go in the second half, but first, I want to say a quick thank you to our sponsors.
This episode is sponsored by our amazing patrons on Patreon. And the cool thing about Patreon is it is 100% free to join the community. We have new things every weekday on the feeds. On Mondays, we have a conversation about what movies, shows, books, podcasts, and whatever else everyone is enjoying. Tuesdays see early access to the week's podcast. Wednesdays have all the links, books, songs, and other content mentioned in the week's episode. Thursday has patrons-only polls, and Fridays are our lightly edited behind-the-scenes video featuring all the cut content, goofs, and bonus facts you could imagine.
We've got some other pretty cool stuff too, like original digital artwork once a month made by Shauna, and direct access to talk with us. No algorithms getting in the way of what we see or don't see. Plus, you can get awesome name recognition like Pat Rowe does every episode. And our top spot is currently occupied by the amazing Mary Halsig Lopez. You can join the Bunny Trails community for free at Bunny Trails Pod on Patreon.
That's patreon.com/bunnytrailspod.
We are going to start off our modern uses in 2003 with the PBS special Red Green's Hindsight is 2020. It is available on DVD from redgreen.com, and here's their synopsis. Quote, "Step into the past with Hindsight is 2020 DVD, a journey that takes you back to Red Green's television debut in 1979. Through a 25-year lens, this collection offers a unique look at what went hilariously wrong during those early years. Relive the moments that shaped Red Green's comedic legacy, witnessing the unexpected mishaps and humorous twists that set the stage for his iconic status. With the blend of wit, charm, and signature humor that fans adore, this DVD paints a vivid picture of the hurdles and laughter that defined Red's journey." End quote. I was a big fan of Red Green when I was a young teenager. He had a show that aired on, it was a Canadian station, but I could see it on my PBS affiliate in the 90s. And it was basically like, so Red Green is the character that is played by Steve Smith. And they're basically, it's a parody of people who go to this hunting lodge and are part of a club. And Red Green is a lovable doofus who is just incompetent at a lot of things. I liked it because it had a lot of juvenile humor that played directly to me as a young teenager at the time. And because I saw Red Green as kind of a hammed up, dorky version of many of the adults in my life, but basically good guys but clueless in certain areas, you know? At least that's what young me thought. But my love and affection for duct tape to this day is still a direct result of Steve Smith's beloved character, Red Green.
That's awesome.
Unsurprisingly, there are numerous self-help and inspirational style books that use Hindsight is 2020 or some variation in the title. Some of them include 2015's 2020 Hindsight, If I Knew Then What I Know Now, I'd Be a Lot Richer. And then the 2016 follow-up, 2020 Hindsight, Additional Lessons for the Entrepreneurs That You Won't Learn About in Business School by Parviz Firozgar. So that was 2015. Okay. There was also 2020's Hindsight 2020 by Carlos Ray Harlow. There was 2021's Hindsight is 2020, 10 Mistakes That Offer Clarity and Vision by Maury Davis. That one's even funnier because it's 10 mistakes that offer clarity and vision, but
nice.
not with your eyesight, but with your future. Woo. 2021 also has a book called Hindsight 2020 by Jesse Jericho. There's 2023's Hindsight, Untold Stories from 2020 by Steve Fowler. And there's also 2023's Hindsight is 2020 by DC Martin. So all of these in some way are self-help or inspirational style books that use the title, that are there trying to make sense of things that have happened in the past to help you have a better future or a more positive future. Hindsight 2020 was an art exhibit available at the Columbia Museum of Art in South Carolina from July 3rd to November 21st, 2021. Here's their description. Quote, "Taking inspiration from the streets and corners of our communities, Hindsight 2020 features 5 photographers of the Carolinas who set out not only to document the extraordinary events of 2020, but also to capture those moments through the eye of an artist, showcasing the work of Hector Vaca Cruz, Thomas Hammond, Catherine Hunsinger, Sean Rayford, and Crush Rush. Hindsight 2020 looks back at historically poignant moments of the Black Lives Matter protests and the COVID-19 pandemic as a means for us to reflect, process, and find clarity." End quote. Hindsight 2020 is a 2024 movie directed by Brian Dobson. Here's the synopsis from Apple TV. Quote, "Hindsight 2020 is a political thriller depicting a worst-case scenario of what America could become in the near future. The film focuses on one of the remaining middle-class families and their struggle to survive. End quote. Now I'm going to close with Hindsight is Always 2020. It is part of the Awakening series of mixed media composites by Alyssa Hinton. Quote, Hindsight is Always 2020 takes place within a longhouse structure and is a visual narrative symbolizing the price, sacrifice, being paid for the destructive choices humankind makes that disregard the future well-being of living things on this planet. This piece is a warning. The sea turtle represents our connection to the earth, and as an amphibian, it also represents the bridge from land to water. In Iroquois creation stories, sky women fell through a hole in the atmosphere and landed on a turtle's back, which, through human and animal cooperation, became the earthly land that supports and nurtures all life. Nothing escapes the turtle's vision, and while it is familiar with the evil face of destruction wrought from fears and lies, it dons protective eyewear to diffuse the damaging glare. It seeks to keep its mind pure, with the turtle, the symbolic foundation, being one of the oldest creatures from the Earth's remote past. The precariousness of its very survival, integral to our own, could summon the end of our own denial and the beginning of our awakening from slumber. End quote. So there are several in this series. The series started in 2021 and is continued onward. But yeah, I really like the work. It is, I wouldn't say it's abstract, but it's definitely not linear.
Yeah. It's I would say it has some abstract elements to it.
Sure.
Yeah, definitely.
I do
It's
like
really
it
cool.
does have a pretty cool sea turtle with these awesome safety glass things on them. They're wearing these
Safety
cool
goggle
yeah,
type of
almost
deal.
like just almost steampunkish even, but yeah, not quite. So
Mhm.
I like them. I thought it was really interesting, but I think the message is also a very good one. So I
Yeah.
wanted to include it here. And I do enjoy the concept of hindsight being a clear form of vision. It takes a special kind of introspection to look back and glean the lessons of life. And things are sometimes easier to understand when you are no longer in the situation. But I do think there's a danger in applying the knowledge of today to the actions of yesterday. We must measure our past with the knowledge that we had at the time and use our clearer vision of the past to shape our understanding moving forward. I think that is the only way hindsight truly becomes as clear as 2020 vision. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. If you have any thoughts on the show or pop culture references we should have included, reach out to us on Patreon, patreon.com/bunnytrailspod, or comment on our website, bunnytrailspod.com.
It is poll time. Recently, we asked our patrons, what's your favorite orchestral section? It turns out our patrons are fans of the strings. There was a tie for second between brass and woodwinds. Pat says, quote, my favorite instrument of all time is the French horn. I have many emotional attachments to this fine instrument. One of them is that my daughter played the famous solo part of the 1812 overture in high school orchestra. She did great. I love all music, having played the piano and viola in my youth. Great admiration for anyone who dedicates their life to the arts in general. End quote.
JGP said, quote, I played French horn a billion years ago in school, and I have always been partial to its mellow tone. But I think I have to vote for strings, because it's just not an orchestra without them. End quote.
I mean, technically that's true, right? Isn't that true?
Well, yes, it is true.
Okay, yeah.
Like JGP, I also played French horn in school, so this is really
Like y'all
interesting.
are French horn
I'm excited to have so many French horn lovers surrounding the show. This is great. But I still love the instrument. But like JGP, I went with a different section than brass. I went with woodwinds. I think the reed instruments give such a rich tone to fill out the orchestra. But of course, I mean, it takes all kinds, and you can't have an orchestra if everybody plays the same instrument. So if you remove any of them, I don't think it works.
Right.
But it's great to have them all in there, and I think it's also awesome that people have different things that they really enjoy to listen to. For me, it's reed instruments. For JGP, it's strings, and for Pat, it's brass. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah. And I'm like, give me an electric guitar.
That is all right. That, you know what, I was gonna say there were no wrong answers to this, but
I've
when you
heard.
create your own, you are now the wrong. You were wrong.
Oh, okay. I really enjoy an electric bass with an orchestra. It's good, good sound.
You're just like Tusk, you know, which had the marching band, you know,
Yeah.
that's you. That's your kind of thing. Yeah, I love the band. Bum, 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 bum. You know, it was an old Fleetwood Mac song or something.
Oh
Or
goodness.
what was it, Metallica with the where they did the whole thing with the orchestra, with the orchestral
Yeah,
background.
it was very
Yeah,
cool.
in the 80s, or yeah, interesting.
Well, as a reminder, our silly pools mean absolutely nothing, and they are not scientifically valid. And patrons of all levels, including our free tiers, can take part. Head over to patreon.com/bunnytrailspod to take this week's poll. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week. Until then, remember,
Words belong to their users.
users.